Okay, this is going to be Lessons from Helene. This is a set of insights that I learned with my team as we did disaster response in the Asheville area of North Carolina. This is a presentation that I originally put together for my church. I've done a bit of reconfiguration and I'm going to make it more to the point as I record it this time. So real quick, the entire point of this is how to avoid being a casualty. So from the perspective of this presentation, the perspective that we're going to take is that we are inside the event, whatever that event is, the natural disaster or something. And so the first point is to survive. Unlike the guy that's in this stretcher here with the thumbs down on top of him, we do not want to be a casualty. So number one, don't be a casualty. And number two, once you get out and you survive, then you have the option of becoming a rescuer. So this guy on the left here, he's got the thumbs up on him. That's nice and fancy, but before you can be that guy, you've got to be at least in the condition of this guy. He's holding up the cell phone, taking a photo. He's at least surviving. So the whole point, don't be a casualty. The perspective we're going to take on this is as an isolated event. We're presuming that whatever the disaster is, it is isolated. This is not a post-apocalyptic scenario that we're discussing. This is assuming that the outside world continues to move, that there are resources from the outside world that will be coming in, and at some point things will get cleaned up, we'll recover and move on with our lives. Specifically Hurricane Helene, you can read the stats on this if you're not familiar with the history, but came into it blew past Florida, went up into North Carolina, Tennessee area, dropped massive amounts of rain on our ground that was already saturated up in the mountains that, as it came down the watershed, just caused devastating floods. I got these images from a YouTuber, Mark Honeycutt, who did a powered paraglider flyby of the area after the event. And so what you ended up with in the higher altitude areas of the mountain were a lot of landslides, trees toppling over, and then as that water made its way down the watershed into the concentrated areas, it carried a lot of that debris into the infrastructure, causing all kinds of damages, flooding, and devastation. Just real quick, I was out in the training thing. We actually in Oklahoma, my team's from Colorado, we heard that there was nothing going on in terms of the government response to this, and so I got a couple buddies together, we drove out, we were able to connect with some locals. The Martyrs Walk, it's an organization led by... This is not a presentation about disasters per se. Those are things that revolve around events, natural disasters, meteorology, geology, whether you got earthquakes, fires, whatever that stuff. So we're not really talking about those. This is more disaster response. And I've broken that down into two categories. Number one, human nature and supply chain. Human nature specifically as it experiences deprivation at a large scale, and supply chain as it experiences disruption at a large scale, whether that be a local disruption like this event or a remote disruption with something like COVID. And as I go through this, you can see I've got highlighted. Human nature is highlighted in yellow, so the title bars for those topics of those lessons will be yellow, and the title bars for supply chain will be green. So to start off, as a survivor, if you survive the event, again, we're assuming that we're inside of this event, whatever it is, you're going to have sensory overload. If you are on scene during the time, you're going to have, sights are going to include chaos, destruction. You're going to see terrible things. It's going to look like a war zone is happening around you, or is war zone after when it's done. If it's a tornado, you're going to have howling winds. Hurricane, you're going to have the same. You're going to have power lines going down, explosions, fires, death and destruction all around you. It's going to be pretty bad. Sounds, again, all the same types of things. After all of it settled down and we came into the area, the infrastructure, a lot of it's not operating. So traffic and power stations and all of the things that rely on the infrastructure, they're not operating. So it gets kind of quiet. But in the moment, at the time, very loud. Smells. So what happens in a flood, specifically, is it floats all of the sewage up, and that gets carried out, and then as it dries, or as the watershed runs off, all of that leaves a residue over everything. Any refrigeration units that were operating, they're going to stop operating, obviously, and so everything's going to start rotting. And if there's bodies, whether it be animals or human cadavers from victims, they will start to decompose. And so shortly after the event, the smell is going to be potentially overpowering. And touch. Everything that you touch is going to be covered, in the case of a flood or something like a 9/11 event, it's going to be covered in dust. And that dust has a very high potential to be toxic. So getting out of it, getting out of whatever situation you're in or surviving it. The people in this case who rescued were neighbors. Neighbors rescued neighbors. You've got to think that, even a local fire department, I say this as somebody who was on a volunteer fire department. First off, firefighters have their own families. Firefighters, cops, National Guard, they've got their own families to worry about. And then after that, then they've got to have a deployment time. And then there's coverage. How many rescue assets are available for a given square mileage area, right? And so it's just the system's not designed to handle that kind of a load on something that's this intense over such a large geographic area. So, we talked to guys who were in the Burnsville area, and, they said they, on like day 3 is when they finally saw a fire department show up. So have a good relationship with your neighbors, be on good terms, because it was the neighbors who helped each other, and for good reason, right? Like a neighbor knows, hey, I've got Joe Blow over here, he's my neighbor, and I know that he's got 2 kids, but I know that they're out of town, so that's not something I have to worry about. Or I know that he's got visitors, so I've got to check and make sure, that he's not dead and that his 2 kids are fine and his visiting family's fine, right? So neighbors know much more about each other than the fire department will. The time to know a skill is before you need it. So if you find yourself surviving an event like this, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to need to happen that are going to rely on an ability that is very different from a world in which the infrastructure exists, the supply chain is not disrupted, and you've got everything that you need and things aren't breaking down all around you. For instance, one of the most obvious ones is the ability to use a physical map, whether it be a road map, a topo map, just knowing where you are. So many things that we take for granted in normal circumstances become very big deals once you remove all of the support structure that's there. How to start a fire, how to filter water, use a gun. And this is one of the biggest things. I would argue that in modern American society, for most of the urban areas especially, people tend to rely on a third-party mediator, aka the cops, to manage the relationship between them and their neighbors, or them and just total complete strangers. And so very few people these days have the ability to successfully engage and build relationship with a total stranger, especially when there's a scenario where you're competing for very limited resources in a very desperate environment. And if you can't do that well in a disaster scenario, you're going to have big problems. And there's no cop that's going to come and mediate the relationship between you and the guy that's, you're trying to compete with or negotiate with to get fuel or food or whatever it is that's limited in a particular scenario. So the ability to negotiate and to build relationships with complete strangers is a fantastic skill that you don't want to be trying to build when it's already too late. Thankfully, traditional roles reassert themselves in these scenarios. Men do men things and women do women things. In our experience, as we traveled around, there were a couple holdouts, and again, this is a couple days after the fact. The event happened on, I want to say it was Saturday, and we got on scene on Thursday. So there were a couple days of the truly desperate time that we weren't there. But by the time we were rolling around, we did run into a different couple operations, and one of them, Barnardsville area, was run mostly as a matriarchal operation run by women who were essentially managing donations. They were doing some welfare checks, but it was mostly kind of a passive operation. On the other side of it, you had something like what we got connected with was the Redneck Air Force operating out of Swannanoa at the Harley-Davidson dealership, and they were very patriarchal in their operation organization. They were going out doing rescues, searching. They had it was 25 or so sorties a day with helicopters, sending out ground teams, doing cadaver searches, just bringing a fantastic amount of resources into the area and a lot of oversight management. So, in fact, as evidenced by Sue, so this story, there was this medic who came in, and she was going to take over operating the first aid station that my team and I were organizing at the time. She brought a pack of cigars and a bottle of whiskey because she knew she was going into an area or an operation staffed by a bunch of manly men, and that was her strategy for getting to know a few of them. A brilliant move on her part that I would highly recommend. But just goes to show, like, that it's just what is natural comes first, and in a disaster scenario, you are not concerned with what is politically correct. You are concerned with what is effective. And so traditional roles reassert themselves. It's my cousin Paul Carr, as he put it, it's like a factory reset on human nature. And intense situations breed intense emotions. So you get people who aren't used to seeing death, destruction, disruption, who aren't used to things like helicopters coming in and working and offloading supplies and gear, and they get very excited. And people who are in an excited state will make comments, they'll make commitments, they'll say things that they wouldn't say in ordinary state of mind. And so you just need to be aware that there's I would say a behavioral or psychological altered mental status for some people when they get into these really exciting situations. So whether they be a victim or a survivor or a rescuer or just a rando, it's just, you need to be aware that emotions will run high. Everyone becomes a Second Amendment advocate because there's no third-party mediator. The cops aren't there to deal with whatever's going on. That network is totally tapped out in terms of its resources, and so people are left to themselves. And if you are somebody who's desperate and you need supplies, you will do desperate things. And if you are someone who has supplies or you have assets and you're using them to take care of your family, you will not want a desperate person depriving your family of its ability to sustain itself. So everybody will carry a gun. Well, everybody who can and has one will carry one. This is a picture here of our team doing security patrol around the pool of assets that we brought on our convoy for the Pole Creek Baptist Church, where they were distributing supplies during the day and needed a way to guard it at night. That being said, in this particular instance, the people with whom we engaged, that we met, the locals, were, I think, because so many civilian sourced assets and donations were coming in, they were just very cheerful and encouraging and helpful people. It was a great community that we discovered. Decisions are going to get made with the information that's available. So the difference I want to highlight here is when you have a blackout event, you've got essentially a black picture of the map where you don't know what's happening at that area. And so the kinds of decisions that people make are, just go exploring, go see what's over there. We would arrive in a place and they'd be like, we don't know, we haven't heard from these people. And in a catastrophic scenario, people assume the worst, right? So we haven't heard from these people, we think they're all dead. You should go check them out. And so after bouncing around doing that for a while, we discovered that wasn't the case, thankfully. But the alternative to that is something like, when a fire department gets a call, they get the information, hey, that's at this location, there's this event going on, these many people are hurt, so there's very actionable specifics that let them gear the resource allocation to the need at the moment. And so in a scenario like this, you'll have a lot less of that and a lot more exploratory actions being taken. The more that you can know beforehand, the better off you'll be. So we're going to transition from the human nature response to disaster. We're going to start looking at supply chain. Assuming that you survive whatever the event is, then you're going to look to start making decisions. And to do that, you're going to need to know what resources you have, what kind of resources you need. So first off, the point that I want to drive home is that very few people understand and appreciate exactly how fragile the supply chain is that we rely on in modern era. You're talking about a system with a global reach, and it's not just the geographic reach, it's process, taking something from raw material all the way to the final product. So there's geographic reach, there's process reach, and then there's relationships, right? Boundaries between countries could go sour. It's just all of exactly how far reaching, the further reaching it is, the more fragile it is. And we live in a system where we rely on a supply chain that is pretty fragile. It does have some backups, some redundancies, There are obviously multiple options for a lot of things, but there are some things for which a lot of them rely on the singular point of travel, or like the Suez Canal, or they rely on a similar pool of raw materials, like your lithium batteries. So I got this little illustration here, and I just quickly made this thing up. It doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of exactly how complicated our supply system is. Between material, energy, and food to bring all these different things together, there's this fantastic process or interconnectedness to all these processes. The whole point, supply chain, fragile. In a disaster scenario, so say, assuming that you survive this, you're going to be looking, okay, what do I have on me? And there's a saying that we have in aviation that what is useless to a pilot is the air above you, the runway behind you, and the fuel that you left on the ground. So it's the stuff that's not available to you. It might as well not even be there, right? In a disaster scenario, you're in an environment that is very desperate, very high consequence, right? What's not on hand is useless. And a great example of that is cash, right? So if you don't have electricity, you can't you don't have an ATM. If there's no power in the city, if you don't have the network, you can't get on your phone and use your bank account or Venmo or any of those things. So it'll come down to what cash do you have on hand. So I highly recommend having some cash on hand in a scenario like this. At the end of the day, what you're talking about is your ability to operate off grid. If the grid goes down, what do you have on you that'll help you survive and operate without the grid? And a great way to practice this and preface this is to just go camping, because camping, generally speaking, is an event that you do where you don't rely on any of those things. You stay in a tent, learn how to start a fire, you have supplies on you that you need for the time that you're out there. It's just a great way to practice living off grid. So, it can be fun. Picture here on this slide, what you'll see here, so on the right, these are the donations that my team brought to on the supply convoy that we could give to the locals. But in addition to having the supplies that we could give out, we had to have supplies that we could operate off of, because we don't want to go in and be a burden on the system that we're trying to help. And so all of the stuff to the left of that green line is what you see of the equipment that we needed in order to be self-sufficient and to not be a drag on the resources that we were going to go allegedly help. Hierarchy of needs. So when we're talking about a disaster scenario, what do you need to have on hand with you in a given moment? And we're basing this hierarchy of needs off of the idea of what's going to kill you first, right? So the typical survival advice, you can live 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And so, given those constraints, what do you address first, right? What do you prioritize in those things? In this picture here, this is a picture I took up at Lock Lake up in Rocky Mountain National Park one winter, right? So if you crash your airplane or something and you survive the crash up on top of the mountains, and this is what you're looking at, like you don't care about water at this moment. You don't care about food. You don't care about being able to charge your phone. You care about not freezing to death, right? So it's what's going to kill you first, and your supplies are going to be driven by that set of priorities. So first off, shelter. Shelter is going to be the number one thing, and we're assuming shelter is going to keep you out of the weather. It's going to keep you from freezing to death or dying of heat stroke or whatever it is, right? So or just maybe just stable ground, right? Like in an earthquake or tsunami or something like that. So some kind of shelter where you're not going to be overcome by your environment. And one of the things that we learned in this trip is really you want to be able to diversify your options when it comes to this, because in some of the areas that we went through, it wasn't just like the house was destroyed. It's that the land the house was sitting on was gone, just gone, right? And so if that was your fallback point, then where do you fall back to now, right? So something, whether it be a storage shelter or a storage unit with some supplies in it, or a neighbor's house, or family or friends or something, or second, location, just something that not all your eggs are in one basket, because what we discovered here is that basket could be blown away, right? We talk like a tornado or any of those other things, or earthquake, same stuff can happen. So you do want to diversify that option if you can. Secondly, communication and intel. So you're going to start making decisions. And again, decisions based off of information that you have, not or information that you don't have. But so the more information you do have is going to help you make good decisions. And whether that's, a resource allocation, right? Do you stay in place? Do you shelter in place? Do you get up and go, right? Like, is there weather moving in? Do you need to get out of there? Or is there weather moving in and you need to stay right where you are? What's happening with your loved ones, right? Like your family across town. Do you need to go rescue them? As much intelligence that you can have ahead of time, like a plan of action, or information that you can get after the fact, whether it be, if you're a ham radio guy, next to your critical meds. And by critical meds, I mean something that's, if you don't have it, you're going to die or become dysfunctional, right? So you get people with things like thyroid medication, right? Like if you don't take that every day, you're not going to survive very long, right? One of the big ones we ran into was diabetes medication, right? So something where, again, normally people keep a supply of this at home for themselves, but, maybe your prescription got washed away. Maybe you were in transit driving down the road and you only had that day's and you don't have any more. And now, the power's out, the grid's down, and you're stuck where you are. So critical meds, if it's going to kill you or make you dysfunctional if you don't have it. After that is energy, right? So you're going to need to run if you have a radio, if you have a computer, a GPS, something that you're using for your ability to navigate, communicate, any of those things, you're going to need batteries for that stuff, whether it be solar charged. If you've got a generator, generator's not going to run without fuel, right? So you've got to have something. Again, if you want to purify water, if you want to cook food, like all of those things require energy. So after you've essentially been stabilized inside your shelter and you have the ability to communicate and get rescue as needed, you're going to need to be able to sustain yourself. And the first thing you need for that is energy. Water. And there's two things to this. Number one, you want some kind of supply on you that is at hand, some bottles or some gallons or something, because, even if you have a filter, you might not have a source to filter from, right? So you want to have something on hand that you can drink immediately. And then you want the ability to filter. And there's potable water, right? Or boil. So there's potable water. And then there is water for, say, flushing toilets. So one of the problems that they had in this area is that none of the toilets flush. So you take raw water from the creek or something like that, you just carry it up in buckets, and that's how you flush your toilets. So some kind of access to water. So immediately water on hand to drink, the ability to filter water for drinking or to boil it, and then some kind of water. It could be raw, but something to flush, wash, laundry, stuff like that. Then food, obviously that, and then weaponry and defensibility. So if you've got a shelter, if you've got food, energy, and water, you're going to become a high value target for people who don't have those things. And so you are going to want the ability to retain those assets. Now, you can do that through defensibility of having a gun on you, or you could do it through being in an area that's just inherently defensible, right? Like at the top of the hill, behind a wall. I don't know, something where people can't get to you. But if you're in suburbia, you're not going to have that option. You're going to want some kind of weaponry on you in order to defend those assets. Medicine, this gets into the things that aren't critical in terms of medication, but stuff that's just going to keep you running healthy. Again, one of the big factors in a survival situation is hygiene. Your medicine is going to be a huge part of your hygiene. Then a form of transportation. Again, you're stabilized. You basically can survive. You can operate, but now you're going to want the ability either to go and get stuff and bring it back, or to get out of there if that's what you need to do. And then finally, comfort items. So like you could live without these things, but they make a big difference when all the other suffering and mayhem is going on. They kind of bring a little bit home. I have a picture here. This is, I have a buddy who has a small business, Crane House Coffee, which is fantastically delicious, that I happened to have a bag on that as we deployed, and it was a great little boost to start our mornings with something like really high quality coffee. All right, supply chain continued. Chainsaws equal liberty. There's two things about chainsaws. Number one, if you have something where you get stuck in a vehicle, you get stuck in a home, you got to get out. Chainsaws are how you can get out a lot of times. And then clearing the roads, right? So maybe your house survived, maybe you survived, but now you've got to get your vehicle, or you've got to get the ability for other people, rescuers or somebody, to get in. And so opening up traffic ways, roads, trails, any of that stuff, a chainsaw will let you do that. And these were, I would say, apart from Starlink, like one of the most ubiquitous tools that we saw employed in this area. everybody was operating chainsaws, and even the places where they weren't, you could tell that they had already been through. They cleared the road of the power lines using chainsaws. So chainsaws are a fantastic tool. Everywhere we went, every operation that was functional was operating off of Starlink. They saved the day. If that hadn't, they'd probably still be doing something, right? It was a fantastic asset, to the extent that at the Redneck Air Force, they got these batches of generators with a gas tank and then gave a Starlink. And so that's the fuel to power the generator to give the electricity to the Starlink so that someone could plug it into their computer and they could have communications, and they could open up that blackout area of information. They could open up the network to be able to make decisions on where to send resources and those sorts of things. So Starlink was fantastic, and after that experience, I'm switching to Starlink. That's what my family and I are getting. So now you've survived the scenario, and you are in a position where you can turn around and start serving as a rescuer for the people around you. So first off, number one, you need to have your own supplies. There's this picture again of the supplies that I carry that is donating to the local community, and then there's the amount of supplies that we needed as a team to be self-sufficient. So you need to be self-sufficient. You need to not be a drag on the resources of the place that you're trying to go help. Secondly, you need to have some kind of skill or asset that you're going to be offering. So you could be a firefighter, a medic, somebody who can run a chainsaw, somebody who can work a dog for cadaver searches or something like that. Or you could just be a local, and you could just be somebody who knows the area really well, and you can help outside resources to find what they need, or to help them be productive. And thirdly, you need to be prepared to be able to do what's necessary. You're going into an environment that is going to be very rough and taxing. If you've survived this, you're going to know what it's like firsthand, but then you're going to be turning around and seeing your neighbors in positions of extreme suffering. You need to have the mental fitness to be able to handle calculating needs, navigating, just operating inside of that environment. So number one, handle the stress, but number two, still be mentally acute while you're there. And you really need to have the humility to be able to do what's necessary. One of the things I told my team was we might get a cool job, or we might get a really not fun job. If we end up getting the job of sitting and guarding a pallet of MREs, if that's a job that needs to be done, that's a job that needs to be done, and we're not going to complain about it. So you just need to be willing to do what's necessary, whether or not that's something that is super exciting or something that's pretty mundane. To that effect, you need to be aware of disaster tourists. A lot of people are going to show up that want to be a part of what's going on, and some of those people are qualified and are the kind of people that you want to be helping out, and some of those people aren't there for the people so much as they are there for themselves. So at one point we ran into this outfit that identified themselves as the Cajun Navy. There's a bunch of volunteers coming in and trying to help out with whatever they could. And we rolled up in this parking lot, and you can see from this picture here, Cajun Navy 1, there's a hut there. And as we approached it was a bunch of volunteers that were getting together, and they wanted to be able to go out on missions. And the guys inside the hut were apparently the people giving out the assignments or coordinating or something to that effect. It was the closest thing resembling an incident command post that they had. And so, we approach it, and the scene was something like those videos I've seen in the New York Stock Exchange, where there's a bunch of people on the floor screaming and yelling, holding up tickets, and they all are trying to get something, and there's like 2 or 3 people up on the stage, trying to coordinate and hand things out or whatever it is. I mean, I'm clearly not a Stock Exchange guy, but that was the image that was presented as we approached. And so I came up and I was like, all right, what can we help? And they said, oh, here, rip off a scrap of paper, hand it to me, and said, write your team name and number down on this, and we'll get back to you. And I was like, okay, so, and as I turned it in, the guy that was up on the stage said, hey, I could really use some help with admin more than anything. And I was like, yeah, sure, I could do admin. So I jump up there, started helping him out. A few minutes later, my buddy comes up and he's like, hey, there's another tent like this, just like right over there across the parking lot. And I was like, can't be kidding. So sure enough, I walk over and there's this Cajun Navy 2 tent. And long story short, what it ended up being is that all of these volunteers showed up. All of them wanted to do this sexy, cool mission. Everybody wants to be the guy slung under the helicopter pulling grandma off the roof of the flooded building. And the reality is that in order to get that asset on site requires a massive amount of foundational support that is a lot of mundane work, right? There's admin work, there's just boring supply management, there's stocking and fueling, there's managing the parking lot, there's the public relations side of it. There's all these very mundane jobs that nobody wanted because they were there to have an experience. They weren't there so much to help people. And that a perfect illustration is this. A few minutes after connecting with the second Cajun Navy tent, I got connected with somebody who drove me over to look at another incident command post that was like a mile and a half down the road from these guys. And this is what I later discovered to be the Redneck Air Force. And these guys were squared away. They were doing their stuff. While we were at the Cajun Navy tent, this volunteer came up and said, "Hey, I'm here to help out with search and rescue, and I only do search and rescue." Like, he wanted nothing to do with any of these other things that needed to happen. He just wanted that sexy job. And I mean, like, okay, bud. And in contradiction to that, we went over to the Redneck Air Force, and one of the first people I met there was this Navy SEAL medic, Smooch. Super cool dude. And I connected with him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I came over here to see what I could do to help, and they asked me if I could inventory the medical supplies, and so that's what I did." And something that is just super mundane, super low key, not there's nothing glamorous about it at all. Like, literally just inventorying the donated, like, over the counter drugs and medical supplies that people have been donating. And yet he was willing to do that because he wanted to be an asset. He wanted to help. Like, he was driven by the desire to help, not by the desire to have an experience. Basically a complete inversion of the people that generally comprised what was the Cajun Navy. And so those guys were really effective, the Redneck Air Force, and the Cajun Navy was so ineffective that literally the next day, the law enforcement came in, shut them down, and told them to get out of town because they were such a liability because they were so disorganized. And so if you find people like that while you are trying to help, don't become a part of that mess. All boils down to, you have to have a willingness to subject yourself to a menial task if that's what's needed. So just be aware of that. Another point to be made, if you're going to get involved in being part of the rescue resources, you need to understand that incident management is supply chain management, right? So there's obviously the assignments, there's the resource roster, and then what you do with that resource roster. Where do you send them? What do you do with people once you've recovered them? One of the problems that they ran into with the Katrina disaster was that once they rescued people off these houses, they didn't really have a place to put them. Their supply chain wasn't managed to the extent that it needed to be in order to solve the full problem. It only solved half the problem. And so then a bunch of people ended up at the Superdome in what became known as basically a living hell on earth. So it is supply chain management. And that's important because what an incident command structure does is that it makes sure that there are the resources where they need to be when they need to be. To the extent that they need to be. So if you don't have it, you're going to end up with resources not where they need to be, and then too many resources where they don't need to be. And so what your responsibility is as somebody who's trying to respond to a situation is you want to find where this incident command is taking place, and you want to put yourself on that resource roster because then you can be part of a coordinated effort. There still won't be the duplication of efforts, and they'll be able to make sure that resources go where they're needed. And the second part of that is, if that's not happening, that's one of the first things that needs to happen. So if you're the first person on scene, start setting something up where you can coordinate with people that are incoming and going to be helping. One of the things to keep in mind as you build out your rescue response is that every inch of ground that you take is going to have to be reclaimed. Whatever the event is, the disaster is going to have affected the entire area. If you've got fire, it's going to be ash or smoke. In this case, it was a flood, and so it again, all that floated mud and sewage came up and then washed away, and so you're left with this toxic dust everywhere. And so every inch of every surface had to be reclaimed before the area could be used. You see a picture here. This is the pharmacy, the ad hoc pharmacy that we're putting up in the Harley-Davidson dealership for the Redneck Air Force. And this is after we've actually gone in and cleaned a lot of it out. You can imagine what it was before. Just an absolute, I mean, it's flood area, right? So it's disgusting. So you've got to reclaim all those surfaces, disinfect them before you can really trust what you're working with. And because of that, again, all that toxic stuff being floated up, then receding, then leaving this film over everything, that's your chances of illness will skyrocket. So you might be wearing gloves and a mask, but you're not going to be doing that 100% of the time. So at some point, you're going to wipe your nose. You're going to touch your eyes or eat food, right? So it's just the probability, the statistical probability that you're going to get sick is much higher in these circumstances. So you need to be taking care of your hygiene, making sure that you're taking care of any kind of immunoboosters that you need, getting the right amount of sleep. So it's just a high stress environment for your immune system as well as for the rest of your body. Okay, so as you move into an area to begin helping with rescue, one of the things that you're going to need is information. You're going to need visibility on what's happening on the ground. And the best way that you're going to be doing that is with relationships. It's people that you have who are in certain areas with whom you have communication that you can say, hey, give me visibility on this. What's happening over in this area? What's happening over in that area? What are your needs? What resources do you have? What can we throw in there? Again, this is all part of that incident command supply chain management. As we were coming in, one of the things, we were moving from Colorado, so we're totally out of the sphere of influence and knowledge, but we had local assets on the ground, the March Walk team, who was able to connect with somebody inside Candler who gave us visibility on what was going on the ground. And the analogy that I like to use with that is it's kind of like it's a tertiary way of getting visibility. It's like looking through a keyhole in a door, and I'm trying to get visibility on the room that's on the other side of the room I'm looking into, right? But I'm looking through this keyhole, and I can see somebody else looking through another keyhole, and so I'm asking him, hey, what do you see in that other room? He's reporting back to me. So it's very limited. But once you get on the ground, the visibility opens up massively, right? So you actually get a real world understanding of what the situation is. But as you begin with, you just got to understand you're going to be limited to what information is available based on the relationships that you have. The thing that you want to do is open up those relationships and expand them as quickly as possible. One of the lessons that we learned in our response to this scenario was that there may or may not actually be any cavalry coming over the hill when it comes to a government response. It was, Thursday, so probably 5 days before the National Guard started showing up with food and water. But you got to think, how far down on the hierarchy of needs is food and water? There's shelter, energy, comms, all those things that keep people alive. There was no rescue effort from the government. So in the first hours and days of where people were losing their lives and livelihoods, there was no government response. And like one of the people we spoke with in Burnsville said, fire department didn't show up for 3 days. There was no evidence of any kind of coordinated incident management system. The government came in basically in time to start recovery efforts. There was no rescue effort from the government. And what that created was a very palpable sense of an unpaid debt for the people who were in the affected areas and who had lost lives and livelihoods. Because you got to think, for example, I'm a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen, and the government exists because I am one of the people who pay for it to exist, right? And ostensibly, it exists for the reasons of serving its people, not the least of which is the ability to respond and bring assets in times of desperate need, like a disaster zone. And when that doesn't happen, you're left with a sense of having paid for something that you did not receive. There is a debt that is unpaid. That was very evidenced in the people's opinion of the government in this area. And it will be interesting to see how that relationship between them and their government plays out over the next couple of years, because they have a lot of reason to be very unimpressed with their government. Most of the work was done by volunteers and contractors. Duke Energy was out there in force getting these things back up, as you can see here. And again, the Redneck Air Force, a great, fantastic bunch of Special Forces veterans, just volunteered their time, came down and did what they could. Those guys were amazing to work with. But nothing from the government. It was the people. The neighbors rescued neighbors, and then neighbors came in from outlying communities to help out. Government was damn near non-existent. And one of the important things to keep in mind about that is that was what happened there. And if you're thinking in your area that it's going to be any different for you, I would invite you to consider that's probably not a realistic expectation. It's probably going to look something similar, because you've got to think that, while it might be different at your state level or your various region of whatever the country is, a lot of these are federal assets that we're talking about, and the same incompetent managers that failed to show up in that scenario are going to be the ones who are in charge of whatever scenario you're in. So just keep that in mind. Also, speaking of resources coming in from outside areas, donations reflect the donors. Anybody who's going to be providing something is going to think of it from their own perspective. They're going to put themselves in the scenario and say, if I were there, what would I need? and they're going to donate according to that because that's their best understanding of what the needs are. And so based on that, we discovered that a lot of the donors in this scenario were both allergenic and diabetic because we got a shit ton of Benadryl and insulin kits. So just FYI. So now we're going to broaden out and start looking at the larger scope of the effect of a disaster. And you got to keep in mind that the damage is going to be extensive. It's going to be generational in nature. You know, one of the problems that we ran into or discovered was there was a lot of animals getting out because the fences had been destroyed. You know, fences that had been there for decades and are gone. And so now the livestock are running out loose, and that is a problem that the owners of that area couldn't fix because they were old people. They couldn't go out and repair a fence, and so you'll just have situations like that, and the landscape, I mean, literally completely changed. But then there's also the economic side. Who's going to be able to repair their houses? Who's going to basically be leaving a dump? Who's going to have to sell to somebody else? What's the business going to look like in that area? Just the geopolitical economic base is going to be very different and have a long-term lasting effect for any area that's hit like this. Finally, each disaster has its own pattern of destruction, right? You know, so a flood is going to affect an area in the low-lying areas, right? So this was a mountainous area that got hit with torrential rains and experienced flooding. Well, who has, you know, how many people in a mountainous area are going to have flooding? Any area that you're in, you want to fortify yourself against what is the most probable type of disaster that you could experience. So if you're on the flat plains of Kansas or Oklahoma, you know, tornadoes, you know, that's the thing. So have those kinds of shelters. But you know, you can fortify against one and make yourself exposed to another, right? So if I put myself in a hole in the holler that gets me away from hurricanes and tornadoes, maybe I'm exposing myself to flood. Just something to keep in mind as you choose the area that you live and as you build out the area where you are living. Action items. So close this up. Number one, make a plan for your family. Know what you're going to do in a given scenario, or tell your outlying family in other areas what they can expect from you if something happens to your area. Get off-grid competent, so go camping. Just get used to operating without the grid. Have a way to defend yourself, whatever that takes. Get to know your community. Build relationships. Your community is going to be your greatest asset in any scenario. Have cash on hand. Obtain physical maps. If you want to navigate around anywhere, your electronics are probably not going to work. So have something you can reference when everything else is down. Have a bug out bag. Just the bare minimum supplies to help you in a variety of circumstances, from having cash inside the bag to having something to start a fire with, something to filter water. You can find resources for putting these things together. I'll put a link in the description for the one that we use. And then build skills. Have a strength mindset. So don't operate off the assumption that you're just always going to have all the fancy things that are going to make life easy for you. Be ready to be in a scenario where it's difficult and you're going to suffer and you're going to need skills. So start developing them. And first and foremost, above all those skills, go out and learn how to talk to and get to know a stranger and build relationships with strangers. That's it. If you got any more, give me some comments. But those were the things that I learned from our experience, and I hope they're helpful to you. Good luck, and God bless you. I hope that you do not experience a disaster, but if you do, this will hopefully help you out.